Mizuki Oka, and I'm a web researcher at the University of Tsukuba. So let me first start talking about myself. When I was 16, I decided to go study at a boarding school in Italy for 2 years by myself. And at that time, I could not speak English or Italian. But after having spent there for 2 years, thanks to my great roommates, I could acquire the level of language that is allowed me to go by everyday life. But if somebody asks me, when did I start to speak the language? I would not be able to say exactly when, but I remember spending the first few months not really understanding what's going on around me. And I had a winter break of about 1 month. And there I stayed at my friend's house. I didn't meet a lot of people, and also I was away from English-speaking environment. So after 1 month, I came back to the school, and I noticed things started to make sense all of a sudden. It seems like as if some kind of consolidation happened in myself, and then things start to make sense. So since then, I wonder what kind of mechanism went under me, and if there is any kind of mechanism that for any system to have this macro phenomena. For me, it was the understanding of language. And when I was doing research, I met this concept or mechanism called fluctuation and self-organization. So fluctuations are the small differences in a system, and self-organization happens because of the amplification of these fluctuations into macro phenomena, which we call self-organization. Or simply, we can say it is the small things that matter to make something big. So this is something that I'd like to talk about today. So, what is actually a self-organization? So this movie of flocking of birds shows a very good example of self-organization. As you can see, this group of birds make this movement. It almost looks like single cell or single creature. But each individual bird is not aware of the global phenomena, but just some movement of its own and some neighboring birds. And this kind of self-organization behavior happens because there is an underlying mechanism that amplifies these small differences into this global macro behavior. So we can also say that small differences, chain of small differences in each individual bird travels over a long distance of this entire group and makes this big movement possible. Another example is in this chemical called droplet. This droplet looks like a natural phenomenon, but it is actually purely artificially made. It is made of very simple ingredients. One is olive oil, and the other is alkaline water. So the olive oil droplet is put into this alkaline water and then forms this droplet. And this oil droplet causes kind of flow within the cell, within the droplet. And because of this flow, this droplet autonomously starts to move. And this was quite surprising as a research, because this was artificially made system started to move by itself. And there is also mechanism of fluctuations in this system. So this is the picture of the oil droplet. And on the surface, there is some chemical reactions. And the chemical reactions on the surface is not homogeneous. There are some differences in the amount of chemical reactions that happens on the surface. And because of these differences, there are many small vortices happening in the oil droplet. And at one point, one vortex is selected and then dominates the entire oil droplet and makes this flow, convection flow. And because of this, it starts to move around. So the fluctuations in these systems is the differences on the surface, and the self-organization behavior is the convection flow, and also the self-moving environment phenomena. So we have looked at two examples of self-organization. One is flocking of birds, and the other is chemical oil droplet. And this kind of self-organization behavior happens also because these complexes are open and complicated. Sorry, it's a complex system, and it has some non-linear properties. But talking of complex systems, nowadays we have probably the most complex systems that we as humans have ever created before, and it's the web. So talking a little bit of myself again, when I was 16 and went to Italy, the only way to communicate with my friends or families in Japan was through emails. And thanks to the web, I could also continue communicating with the friends after I came back to Japan. And I think nowadays, people in this room as well maybe share the same feeling of how much we can now do with this system of the web. So, what about the fluctuations and self-organization behaviors in the web? I said the web is complex. And the reasons why the web has become so complex is partially thanks to social network services. With the social network services, people become more or less like sensors. We collect information around within the environment and contribute the information to the web. And thanks to these kind of services, the web has become complex. And this is a visualization of how people treat in an environment. So maybe the web today looks like this now. So the web is composed of networks connected by users. And it's also connected to the real world. And if something happens in the real world, it goes through this network and some information flow happens. And this web almost behaves like a single creature. If something big happens, the web also responds to it, to the event. And there's even sometimes this kind of angel phenomena. And we talk about the web as if it's a living creature. So maybe one day we'll be talking about the web as if it's a living creature and saying, oh, today the web is feeling sad or the web is feeling happy. So what about the self-organization behavior we can observe in the web? Maybe one of the most salient features of the web is the burst. Burst is a kind of event, or is the sudden increase in the number of mentions of a particular event. For example, this graph shows two examples of burst. One is Christmas. So people talk about Christmas on the day of 24th or the 21st, 25th. So you can see there is a sudden increase in the number of mentions about Christmas. And we can also see that people talk about Christmas a few weeks before, a few months before the actual event. And we can see many more bursts for the case of earthquake, because there are many earthquakes happen in Japan, and people kind of talk about it every time there's an earthquake. So we can consider these kind of bursting behaviors as self-organization phenomena of the web. So what about fluctuations? What is the element that is amplified to cause these bursting behaviors? That's the research question I have. So to answer this question, we can refer to one of a very known theory called fluctuation theory in the statistical physics field. And this theory says when things fluctuate more, the response becomes larger. So imagine a ball in a plate and say there is some fluctuation. The ball is fluctuating a little bit in this plate. And if somebody takes this ball and shakes it, maybe the ball wouldn't go out of the plate because the fluctuation is small. But if the ball is fluctuating very much in the plate with some extra stimuli from outside, the ball may go out. So like I said, this theory says if the fluctuation is larger, the response would be also larger. So if we take this analogy to the case of the web, we can take the plate as the environment of or particular service on the web. We can say Twitter. And the ball is a particular event. What about the fluctuations? Here we can consider the number of tweets or number of mentions about a particular event. And the ball going out of the plate is the burst. So what we wanted to look for is whether if the number of times some keyword appears in the web has something to do with the size of the burst. So the same analogy with the ball and the plate. So we actually collected Twitter data for over 2 years, and we collected about 300 million tweets. And we analyzed the most frequently appearing keywords of 3,000 and looked to see whether the fluctuation before the burst has anything to do with the size of the burst. And luckily, we got this result. On the horizontal line, we take the fluctuation size. So as you go, larger the fluctuation means size means larger. And on the vertical line, we take burst size. So this graph actually shows that there is a positive correlation between the fluctuation size and the burst. Taking an example of Christmas, it means that if people talk one day more and one day less, and the number of mentions about Christmas is larger, then the actual burst or increase in the excitement of Christmas is larger. But the web does not only show another example of self-organizations, but the self-organization that is embedded in the web could develop and extend the idea of the self-organization. For example, we found that the kinds of relations between this fluctuation size and the burst size are different for each keyword. This means that there might be different kinds of mechanisms for self-organization happening, even in the same Twitter sphere. So, what does this all scientific results or phenomena tells us? I think it tells us that usually these kind of fluctuations or mechanisms that is amplified to cause self-organization behavior is very, very difficult to find. But once it is found, this phenomena emerges. The important thing and interesting thing here is that it's not something that we can know or design beforehand. It is a collective behavior that is emerged within the system. So when I was 16, I decided to go to Italy and shakes my brain or fluctuates me in this environment. And the self-organization maybe phenomena was that I could learn the language. Or when I was 16, I could not imagine myself standing here and giving that talk in English. So I like to say that why don't we try to fluctuate ourselves? That maybe mean that doing something that you have never done or doing something that scares you. And maybe something that you cannot imagine now will happen. So it is the fluctuation that matters, maybe more than you think. Thank you very much.